Summer of 1901. The small town of Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, basked in the golden light of a season that would be remembered not for its harvest, but for something far more unsettling. It was here, in a modest wooden house on Elm Street, that photographer Samuel Hartwell set up his cumbersome equipment on a Tuesday afternoon in July, preparing to capture what would become one of the most disturbing family portraits in American history. The Whitmore family had commissioned the photograph as a celebration of their prosperity. After years of struggle, Thomas Whitmore's grain mill had finally turned profitable, and his wife Eleanor believed a formal portrait would commemorate their good fortune. They dressed in their finest attire, Thomas in his dark Sunday suit, Eleanor in her best blue dress with pearl buttons, and their 4 children arranged according to Victorian convention. The eldest son, William, stood tall at 14. The twin daughters, Margaret and Sarah, both 11, sat primly with their hands folded. And there, at the front, positioned carefully by the photographer's assistant, sat little Grace Whitmore, barely 6 years old, her blonde curls catching the afternoon light. The session proceeded normally. Hartwell, a respected photographer with 20 years of experience, had captured hundreds of family portraits throughout Pennsylvania and Ohio. He knew the routine: position the subjects, adjust the lighting, remind them to remain perfectly still for the lengthy exposure time required by the glass plate technology of the era. Children were always the most challenging subjects, prone to fidgeting and blinking, but Grace Whitmore sat remarkably still, her small hands placed neatly in her lap, her face turned toward the camera with unusual composure for a child her age. What happened next would haunt Samuel Hartwell for the remainder of his days. As he prepared to trigger the camera's mechanism, he noticed something peculiar about the youngest girl's expression. While her parents and siblings maintained the solemn, dignified composure typical of portrait subjects of that era, Grace Whitmore's lips began to curve upward. Not the innocent, spontaneous smile of child. The entire episode. The family dispersed, thanking him for his services and arranging to collect the finished photographs the following week. But as Hartwell packed his equipment, his hands continued to shake, and a persistent chill seemed to settle in his bones despite the summer heat. 3 days later, when Hartwell developed the glass plate in his darkroom, the image that emerged from the chemical bath stopped him cold. There, captured with crystalline clarity, was the Whitmore family in all their formal dignity. But the youngest daughter's face bore an expression that should have been impossible. Her smile stretched from ear to ear, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp for a 6-year-old child. Her eyes reflected a light that had not been present in the room, a luminescence that seemed to emanate from within the photograph itself. More disturbing still was the uncanny perfection of her pose. While the other family members showed the slight blurriness common to long exposures, the small details that occurred when subjects inevitably moved, despite their best efforts. Grace appeared with supernatural clarity. Every curl in her hair, every fold in her dress, every line of that impossible smile was rendered with such precision that she seemed to exist in a different dimension from the rest of her family. Hartwell's assistant, a young man named Peter Mills, was the first to see the developed photograph. According to Hartwell's later testimony, Mills took one look at the image and immediately stepped backward, knocking over a tray of developing chemicals in his haste to distance himself from the portrait. When questioned about his reaction, Mills could only stammer that the little girl's smile appeared to be moving, following his gaze as he examined different areas of the photograph. Word of the unusual portrait spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community. The Whitmore family, initially pleased with the formal dignity captured in most of the image, found themselves increasingly disturbed by their youngest daughter's expression. Eleanor Whitmore would later write in her diary that looking at the photograph made her feel as though Grace was sharing a secret joke at her expense. Of this world, it speaks of knowledge that no innocent should possess, of secrets that should remain buried. I left the Whitmore house immediately and have not returned since, though Eleanor has sent 3 invitations for tea. As the summer of 1901 drew to a close, the portrait that was meant to celebrate the Whitmore family's happiness had become a source of growing unease, not only for the family themselves, but for everyone who laid eyes upon it. What had begun as an ordinary afternoon photography session had produced something extraordinary and terrifying, an image that would challenge everything the people of Millbrook believed about the innocence of childhood and the simple act of capturing a moment in time. To understand the profound impact of the Whitmore family portrait, one must first grasp the cultural significance of photography in early 20th century America. By 1901, the art of capturing images had evolved from an expensive novelty, available only to the wealthy, into a cherished ritual that defined family life across all social classes. The invention of more affordable cameras and the establishment of traveling photographers like Samuel Hartwell had brought this technology to small towns throughout the nation, where it served a purpose far deeper than mere documentation. Photography in this era represented nothing less than the conquest of time itself. For families like the Whitmores, who had watched parents and grandparents disappear into memory with no visual record of their existence, the ability to freeze a moment forever held almost mystical significance. These images became sacred objects, displayed prominently in parlors, and passed down through generations as tangible proof of family continuity and respectability. The formal nature of portrait photography in 1901 reflected the solemnity with which families approached this process. Subjects dressed in their finest clothing, often purchasing new garments specifically for the occasion. The long exposure times required by the technology of the era, typically ranging from 15 seconds to over a minute, demanded perfect stillness from all participants. This technical limitation contributed to the characteristic, serious expressions found in photographs of the period, as maintaining a smile between progress and tradition that characterized rural America at the turn of the century. Founded in 1853 as a mill town along the Susquehanna River, it had grown to a population of just over 800 residents by 1901. The community centered around Thomas Whitmore's grain mill, which processed wheat and corn from the surrounding farms and provided employment for nearly a quarter of the town's working men. Despite its embrace of industrial progress, Millbrook remained deeply rooted in the folk traditions and superstitions brought by its predominantly German and Irish immigrant population. Belief in omens, premonitions, and supernatural intervention remained common, particularly among the older residents, who had witnessed the gradual transformation from wilderness to civilization. The boundary between the natural and supernatural was understood to be permeable, requiring constant vigilance and respect for forces beyond human comprehension. This cultural backdrop proved crucial to understanding the community's reaction to the Whitmore portrait. In a society where death was a frequent visitor to every household, where medical science remained primitive, and where unexplained phenomena were accepted as part of the divine mystery, the appearance of something genuinely unnatural carried profound implications that extended far beyond mere curiosity. The Whitmore family themselves represented the aspirational middle class that formed the backbone of small-town American society. Thomas Whitmore had arrived in Millbrook as a young man, with little more than determination and a basic understanding of mill operations. Through 15 years of hard work and careful investment, he had built his business into the most successful enterprise in the county, providing him with the financial means to purchase the finest house on Elm Street and to commission the family portrait that would ultimately define his legacy. Eleanor Whitmore, née Patterson, brought respectability and social connections to the marriage. Daughter of a prominent merchant from nearby Harrisburg, she had received an education unusual for women of her era, including training in music, literature, and the social graces expected of a mill owner's wife. Her marriage to Thomas had been viewed as a beneficial alliance for both families. Had suffered 2 miscarriages. Her arrival was celebrated as a divine blessing. Neighbors consistently remarked upon her unusual intelligence and precocious manner of speaking, often noting that she possessed an almost adult understanding of complex situations that should have been beyond her comprehension. The decision to commission a family portrait reflected the Whitmores' desire to cement their position within Millbrook's social hierarchy. Such photographs served as public declarations of prosperity and respectability, displayed prominently for visitors to admire, and serving as tangible evidence of a family's success in overcoming the challenges of frontier life. Samuel Hartwell, the photographer chosen for this important task, brought impressive credentials to the assignment. Trained in Philadelphia under the renowned portraitist William Rao, Hartwell had spent 20 years perfecting his craft throughout Pennsylvania's rural communities. His reputation for technical excellence and his ability to capture the dignity inherent in his subjects had made him the photographer of choice for the region's most prominent families. The summer of 1901 had been particularly busy for Hartwell, as the prosperity brought by a successful harvest season had encouraged many families to invest in formal portraits. He had photographed the mayor of Lancaster, several prominent merchants from York, and numerous farming families who had experienced unusually profitable years. The Whitmore Commission represented the culmination of a successful season, a routine assignment that he approached with the confidence born of extensive experience. None of the cultural, social, or technical factors that defined photography in this era could have prepared anyone for what emerged from Hartwell's darkroom on that July afternoon. The image that would soon transform the Whitmore family from respected community members into subjects of fearful speculation challenged not only the conventions of portrait photography, but the fundamental assumptions about reality that governed life in small-town America at the dawn of the 20th century. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong with the Whitmore family portrait came not from the family themselves, but from Peter Mills, Samuel Hartwell's young assistant. Shapes of the Whitmore family gradually materialized in the chemical solution exactly as expected, with Thomas and Eleanor maintaining their dignified poses, the older children arranged with formal precision, and little Grace positioned at the front of the composition. It was only as the developing process neared completion as the final details sharpened into crystal clarity, that Mills noticed something fundamentally disturbing about the youngest child's expression. The smile that had unnerved Samuel Hartwell during the actual photography session had been captured with horrifying fidelity. But more than that, the developed image seemed to reveal aspects of the expression that had not been visible to the naked eye during the session itself. The curve of Grace's lips extended further than anatomically possible for a 6-year-old child, creating a grotesque caricature of joy that spoke of knowledge far beyond childhood innocence. Mills's hands began to shake as he examined the photograph more closely, using the magnifying glass that Hartwell employed for quality inspection. The child's teeth, barely visible during the actual session, appeared in the photograph with unsettling prominence. They seemed too numerous for her small mouth, crowded together in a way that suggested something predatory rather than innocent. More disturbing still were her eyes, which reflected a light source that had not existed in the Whitmore parlor during the photography session. The young assistant's testimony, recorded in Dr. Carstairs' case notes, provides a chilling account of his first encounter with the fully developed portrait. The little girl's eyes followed the magnifying glass as I moved it across the photograph. "I know how that sounds, doctor, but I swear upon my mother's grave that those eyes tracked my movement. When I focused the glass on her left eye, it seemed to dilate, as though responding to my attention. When I shifted to examine her smile, the eye I had just been studying appeared to wink." Mills immediately called for Hartwell, who was preparing his equipment for the next day's appointments in the front room of his studio. The photographer's initial reaction was one of professional concern. "Assuming that some possible," Hartwell whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of running water from the developing trays. The child was perfectly still during the exposure. I watched her throughout the entire 30 seconds. Her expression was normal, perhaps slightly serious, but nothing like this. He pointed to Grace's impossible smile with a shaking finger, careful not to actually touch the surface of the glass plate. Mills suggested that perhaps the long exposure time had somehow distorted the child's expression, capturing movement that had occurred too quickly for human eyes to detect. But Hartwell rejected this explanation immediately. His years of experience had taught him to recognize every form of movement artifact that could affect a photograph, and this was something entirely different. The rest of the family showed no signs of movement whatsoever, and Grace herself appeared with supernatural clarity in every other aspect of her appearance. The two men spent the remainder of the afternoon examining the photograph under various lighting conditions, searching for any technical explanation that might account for the disturbing image. They checked the glass plate for cracks or imperfections that might have distorted the developing process. They reviewed the chemical solutions for contamination that could have affected the final result. They even re-examined Hartwell's detailed notes from the photography session, looking for any detail that might explain what they were seeing. Every technical investigation yielded the same conclusion. The photograph was technically perfect, the result of a flawless exposure and development process. The disturbing nature of Grace Whitmore's expression could not be attributed to any error in equipment or procedure. Whatever had been captured on that glass plate represented something that had actually existed in the Whitmore parlor during those 30 seconds of exposure. Something that had somehow escaped the notice of everyone present, except the camera itself. Word of the unusual photograph began to spread through Millbrook's small community almost immediately. Mills, despite Hartwell's instructions to maintain professional discretion, found himself unable to keep silent about what he had witnessed. During an evening visit to his local tavern, he confided in several friends about the strange portrait, describing the impossible smile. Within 48 hours of the photograph's development, a steady stream of curious visitors began arriving at Hartwell's studio, requesting to see the unusual portrait for themselves. The photographer found himself in an impossible position, torn between professional obligation to his client's privacy and growing pressure from community members, who had heard increasingly dramatic accounts of the image. The Whitmore family had not yet collected their photographs, leaving Hartwell as the sole custodian of what was rapidly becoming the most discussed image in the town's history. The first encounter with the Whitmore family portrait had established one undeniable fact. Something extraordinary and deeply unsettling had been captured on that summer afternoon in July. What remained to be determined was whether this something represented a technical anomaly, a supernatural phenomenon, or something far more sinister that challenged the very foundations of reality in small-town Pennsylvania. As news of the unusual portrait spread throughout Millbrook, residents began to recall previous incidents involving young Grace Whitmore that had seemed merely eccentric at the time, but now took on a more sinister significance. Mrs. Beatrice Thornton, who lived in the house adjacent to the Whitmore property, was among the first to come forward with disturbing observations about the child's behavior in the months preceding the photography session. Mrs. Thornton, a widow of 62, who spent considerable time tending her garden along the fence line between the properties, had frequently observed Grace playing alone in the Whitmore backyard. What struck her as unusual was not the solitary nature of the child's play, which was common enough for the youngest member of a busy family, but rather the animated conversations Grace seemed to conduct with invisible companions. The child would laugh, respond to unheard questions, and even pause as though listening intently to responses from her unseen playmates. Initially, Mrs. Thornton had dismissed these observations as typical childhood imagination, the kind of elaborate fantasy play that many children employed to entertain themselves. However, as she continued to observe Grace's behavior over several weeks, certain aspects began to trouble her. The child's conversations followed patterns too sophisticated for typical childhood make-believe. "They won't understand. Can't we wait until after the picture?" This snippet of overheard conversation gained new significance after the portrait session, suggesting that Grace had somehow anticipated the unusual events that would surround the photography. The Whitmore family's own documentation of their youngest daughter's behavior provides even more compelling evidence of the gradual changes that preceded the portrait session. Eleanor Whitmore's private diary, discovered years later among the family's abandoned possessions, contains numerous entries expressing growing concern about Grace's development during the spring and summer of 1901. An entry dated May 15th reveals Eleanor's confusion about her daughter's increasingly sophisticated vocabulary. Grace used the word ephemeral correctly in conversation today, describing the brief appearance of fireflies at dusk. When I asked where she had learned such a word, she simply smiled and said that someone had explained it to her. Yet she has had no contact with anyone outside our immediate family and the children at Sunday school, none of whom would employ such advanced terminology. More troubling entries describe Grace's nocturnal behavior during this period. Eleanor wrote on June 3rd, "I was awakened last night by the sound of Grace's laughter coming from her bedroom. When I investigated, I found her sitting upright in bed, carrying on a whispered conversation with someone I could not see. Her eyes were open and alert, focused on a corner of the room that appeared empty to me. When I asked whom she was speaking with, she replied that her friends were teaching her important things she would need to know soon. The family's cook, Mrs. Hannah O'Brien, provided additional testimony about Grace's behavior during meal preparations. A devout Catholic who had worked for several prominent families throughout central Pennsylvania, Mrs. O'Brien possessed extensive experience with children of all ages and temperaments. Her observations of Grace Whitmore's conduct during the summer of 1901 left her deeply unsettled. Mrs. O'Brien reported that Grace had begun demonstrating knowledge of events occurring outside the household that she could not possibly have learned through normal means. On multiple occasions, the child accurately predicted visitors before they arrived, described the contents of letters before they were opened, and mysteriously, and suggests that her friends had told her many interesting things about the people around her. The town's schoolteacher, Miss Adelaide Harper, contributed additional evidence of Grace's unusual development during the brief period when the child attended summer classes at the local one-room schoolhouse. Miss Harper, who had taught in Millbrook for over 15 years, prided herself on her ability to assess children's capabilities and potential. Her encounters with Grace Whitmore challenged her professional understanding of childhood development in ways that left her deeply troubled. According to Miss Harper's detailed records, Grace consistently demonstrated reading comprehension far beyond her chronological age, easily managing texts that challenged students several years older. More remarkably, the child showed an intuitive understanding of mathematical concepts that had not been taught, solving complex problems through methods that Miss Harper could not identify or duplicate. Most unsettling to the experienced teacher was Grace's apparent ability to anticipate the content of lessons before they were presented. The child would often bring books from home that directly related to topics Miss Harper had planned to introduce days later, claiming that her friends had suggested she would find the subjects interesting. When Miss Harper questioned Grace about these friends, the child would only smile and explain that they knew many things about many people. Dr. Edmund Carstairs, Millbrook's only physician, was eventually asked by Eleanor Whitmore to examine Grace, after her concerned observations reached a level that demanded professional intervention. Dr. Carstairs had delivered Grace at birth and had monitored her development throughout her early years, consistently noting her exceptional intelligence and social maturity. However, his examination in late June of 1901 revealed changes that defied his medical understanding. The physician's private notes, preserved in his medical journal, describe a child who appeared physically normal in every respect, but demonstrated cognitive and perceptual abilities that seemed impossible given her age and limited experiences. Grace accurately described the contents of Dr. Carstairs' medical. These accumulated observations, documented by multiple reliable witnesses throughout the summer of 1901, established a pattern of increasingly unusual behavior that culminated in the disturbing portrait session. The evidence suggested that whatever had been captured in Samuel Hartwell's photograph was not an isolated anomaly, but rather the visible manifestation of changes that had been occurring in Grace Whitmore for months, changes that defied every conventional understanding of childhood development and human capability. The involvement of outside authorities in the Grace Whitmore phenomenon began in early August of 1901, when Eleanor Whitmore's growing desperation led her to seek guidance from sources beyond the small community of Millbrook. Her first contact was with Reverend Jonathan Blackwood, a traveling Methodist minister known throughout central Pennsylvania for his expertise in matters of spiritual significance and his willingness to confront situations that other clergymen preferred to avoid. Reverend Blackwood arrived in Millbrook on August 10th, carrying with him a reputation built over 20 years of ministry in rural communities, where the boundary between faith and superstition remained fluid. He had counseled families through cattle deaths attributed to hexes, investigated reports of spectral apparitions in abandoned homesteads, and even performed what he carefully termed spiritual cleansings in houses where unexplained phenomena had disrupted normal family life. However, nothing in Blackwood's extensive experience had prepared him for his encounter with the Whitmore family portrait. Eleanor had arranged for the minister to examine the photograph in the privacy of the family parlor, hoping that his spiritual authority might provide some explanation for the disturbing image that had transformed her household from a place of contentment into a source of constant unease. Blackwood's initial reaction to the portrait was documented in a letter he sent to his bishop in Harrisburg 3 days after his visit. Your Grace, I have witnessed phenomena that challenge my understanding of divine providence and the natural order. The child's expression in this photograph speaks of knowledge that no mortal soul should possess while dwelling in earthly flesh. The smile contains depths of understanding that suggest consultation Eleanor had requested. According to Blackwood's detailed report to his bishop, Grace demonstrated knowledge of biblical passages that even seminary students would find challenging, quoting complex theological arguments in ancient Greek and referencing obscure interpretations of Scripture that existed only in specialized academic texts. More disturbing still, the child seemed able to discern Blackwood's private thoughts and personal struggles, addressing doubts about his faith that he had never voiced to another human being. The minister's account describes Grace's manner during their conversation as eerily mature, her childish voice delivering observations about the nature of existence, the purpose of suffering, and the relationship between earthly life and eternal judgment that demonstrated comprehension far beyond her years. When Blackwood attempted to redirect their discussion toward more appropriate topics for a 6-year-old, Grace smiled her characteristic unsettling smile and suggested that her friends had taught her that conventional expectations about childhood were merely human limitations that need not constrain those chosen for special purposes. Word of Reverend Blackwood's hasty departure from Millbrook spread rapidly through the network of Methodist congregations throughout central Pennsylvania, attracting attention from other religious authorities who specialized in unusual spiritual phenomena. Father Michael Donnelly, a Catholic priest from nearby Harrisburg who had studied cases of reported possession and miraculous visitations, arrived in Millbrook on August 20th to conduct his own investigation. Father Donnelly's approach differed significantly from Blackwood's evangelical methodology. Trained in the careful documentation protocols developed by the Vatican for investigating supernatural claims, the priest brought scientific rigor to his examination of the Whitmore situation. His detailed case notes, preserved in the archives of the Diocese of Harrisburg, provide the most comprehensive professional assessment of Grace's unusual abilities. The priest's initial interview with Grace took place in the neutral setting of the town's public library, away from the charged atmosphere of the Whitmore household. Father Donnelly's notes describe a child who appeared normal in every physical respect, but demonstrated intellectual capabilities them for her future responsibilities. The priest's most disturbing observation concerned Grace's apparent ability to perceive spiritual dimensions invisible to normal human perception. During their interview, the child would occasionally pause in conversation to listen to voices that Father Donnelly could not hear, responding to questions from unseen speakers and even laughing at remarks that only she could perceive. When the priest asked her to describe these invisible companions, Grace replied that they were teachers who had been waiting a very long time for someone suitable to prepare for an important task. Medical authorities became involved in the investigation when Dr. Harrison Whitfield, a specialist in childhood development from the University of Pennsylvania, traveled to Millbrook at the request of Dr. Carstairs, who felt the situation required expertise beyond his rural practice capabilities. Dr. Whitfield had published several papers on precocious intellectual development in children and possessed one of the most extensive professional backgrounds in childhood psychology available in Pennsylvania at the turn of the century. Dr. Whitfield's examination of Grace took place over 3 days in late August, employing the most advanced psychological assessment methods available in 1901. His findings, published in the Journal of Developmental Psychology the following year, described cognitive abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Grace demonstrated perfect recall of complex information after single exposures, solved mathematical problems using techniques that had not been formally discovered until years later, and displayed understanding of abstract concepts that typically required years of advanced education to develop. Most puzzling to Dr. Whitfield was Grace's apparent access to information that existed outside her direct experience. The child accurately described events occurring in distant locations, provided detailed accounts of historical incidents that had never been documented in available sources, and demonstrated knowledge of scientific principles that would not be formally recognized for decades to come. The involvement of these outside authorities transformed what had begun as a local mystery into a matter of regional concern. Reports of their findings began appearing in newspapers throughout Pennsylvania, attracting attention from academic institutions, religious organizations. Morning of September 15, 1901, Eleanor Whitmore discovered her youngest daughter's lifeless body in the child's bedroom, positioned peacefully in bed, as though Grace had simply failed to wake from natural sleep. No signs of illness, injury, or struggle were evident. The child, who had demonstrated impossible knowledge and unsettling abilities, had departed the world as mysteriously as she had manifested her extraordinary gifts. Dr. Edmund Carstairs was summoned immediately to examine the body and determine the cause of death. His medical investigation, conducted with the thoroughness demanded by the unusual circumstances surrounding the child, revealed no evidence of disease, poisoning, or physical trauma. Grace's body showed no signs of the common childhood ailments that claimed so many young lives in rural Pennsylvania during this era. Her heart, lungs, and other vital organs appeared perfectly healthy, offering no explanation for her sudden demise. The physician's preliminary report, filed with the county coroner's office, documented his complete bewilderment at the medical mystery. After comprehensive examination, I can identify no cause for this child's death. Her physical condition appears consistent with normal sleep, yet she cannot be roused by any means. All vital signs have ceased, but the body shows none of the typical indicators of disease or distress that precede natural death in children of this age. Thomas and Eleanor Whitmore, devastated by the loss of their youngest child, arranged for a funeral service that reflected both their grief and the unusual circumstances that had surrounded Grace's final months. The memorial service was held at Millbrook's Methodist Church, with Reverend Samuel Peters, the congregation's regular minister, conducting the ceremony. Reverend Blackwood, despite being specifically invited by Eleanor, declined to return to Millbrook for the service, claiming urgent responsibilities elsewhere that prevented his attendance. The funeral arrangements included a final family portrait, a common practice in the early 20th century that allowed grieving families to create a permanent memorial incorporating their deceased loved ones. This posthumous photography session, finest white dress and surrounded by flowers from Eleanor's garden. The photographer proceeded with professional efficiency despite his personal discomfort, adjusting the lighting and positioning to ensure proper exposure of both the living family members and their deceased daughter. The technical challenges of posthumous photography required careful attention to lighting angles that would minimize the obvious differences between living and dead subjects, while maintaining the formal dignity expected in such memorials. However, when Hartwell developed the glass plate 3 days later, the resulting image contained elements that defied every principle of photographic science and rational understanding. The surviving Whitmore family members appeared exactly as expected, captured with the technical excellence that had established Hartwell's professional reputation. Grace's body in the casket was clearly visible, displaying the peaceful repose of death with appropriate dignity, but standing behind the casket, positioned where no living person had been present during the photography session, was a second image of Grace Whitmore. This figure appeared with the same supernatural clarity that had characterized her expression in the original family portrait, wearing the same white dress as the body in the casket, but displaying that same impossible smile that had first disturbed Samuel Hartwell months earlier. The standing Grace looked directly at the camera, with eyes that seemed to reflect an inner light, her small hand raised in what appeared to be a gesture of farewell, or perhaps invitation. Hartwell's assistant, Peter Mills, who had first witnessed the unsettling nature of Grace's original portrait, was present when the posthumous photograph was developed. His account of that moment, recorded in his personal diary, describes an experience that challenged his sanity. The dead child appeared twice in the same photograph, once lying peacefully in her casket, and again standing beside her own body as though death had simply separated her into two distinct forms. The standing figure smiled with the same terrible knowledge that had marked the original portrait, but now her expression seemed to convey satisfaction, as though some long-anticipated event had finally been accomplished. The photographer and his assistant spent hours examining the glass plate under different lighting conditions. Combination of a child's mysterious death and photographic evidence of her apparent survival in some form created a level of community panic that threatened the town's fundamental stability. Families began removing their children from school, church attendance dropped precipitously, and several residents made preparations to abandon Millbrook entirely. The situation attracted attention from authorities beyond the local religious and medical professionals who had previously investigated Grace's unusual abilities. Representatives from the Pennsylvania State Police arrived in Millbrook on September 25th to investigate reports of supernatural phenomena that might indicate fraud or criminal activity. Their inquiry focused initially on the possibility that the Whitmore family, or Samuel Hartwell, had manufactured the disturbing photographs through some form of deliberate deception. However, The state investigators quickly discovered that no known photographic technique available in 1901 could have produced the effects visible in either the original family portrait or the posthumous memorial image. Detective William Morrison, who led the investigation, had consulted with photographic experts from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh before concluding that the images represented genuine phenomena that could not be explained through conventional means. More disturbing to the investigators was their discovery of physical evidence that supported the supernatural interpretation of Grace's photographs. The child's bedroom, sealed since her death, showed signs of recent occupancy, despite being continuously guarded by family members. Personal items had been moved, books had been opened to specific passages, and messages had been written in childish handwriting on previously blank pages of Grace's diary. The final entry in Grace's diary, discovered by Detective Morrison during his investigation of the bedroom, provided chilling insight into the child's understanding of her own fate. "My friends tell me that soon I will be able to help them in ways I cannot, while I remain in this small body. They promise that dying is not really ending, but just becoming more than I was before. I am not frightened, because they have shown me what comes next, and it is much more interesting than what most people think death means." The investigation revealed additional evidence involving authorities from multiple jurisdictions and disciplines in an investigation that challenged fundamental assumptions about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. The child who had smiled her impossible smile in a summer family portrait had departed physical existence in a manner that suggested her unusual abilities represented only the beginning of a phenomenon that transcended the boundaries between mortal life and whatever lay beyond. The immediate aftermath of Grace Whitmore's death and the discovery of her impossible posthumous portrait created a crisis of faith and reason that extended far beyond the boundaries of small-town Millbrook. By October of 1901, the story had been picked up by newspapers throughout Pennsylvania and beyond, attracting attention from investigators, academics, and curiosity seekers, who descended upon the quiet mill town in numbers that overwhelmed its modest infrastructure and peaceful character. The Whitmore family, unable to cope with the constant scrutiny and the traumatic implications of their youngest daughter's supernatural legacy, made the decision to abandon their prosperous life in Millbrook and seek anonymity elsewhere. On October 12th, barely a month after Grace's funeral, Thomas sold his mill to a consortium of investors from Harrisburg at a significant financial loss, liquidating his life's work with a desperation that spoke to the unbearable pressure the family faced. Eleanor's final diary entry before the family's departure, discovered years later among personal effects left behind in their hasty evacuation, provides insight into the psychological toll of their experience. We cannot remain in a place where our child's death has become a source of public spectacle and scientific investigation. The Grace who smiled at us from those terrible photographs was no longer the daughter we had raised and loved. Whatever she became in her final months, whatever forces claimed her for purposes we cannot understand, we must flee from the memory and seek whatever peace might be found in forgetting. The family's departure did nothing to diminish interest in the photographs themselves, which had become the most documented supernatural evidence in American history to that point. Present, temperature readings fluctuated without explanation, and several graduate students reported feeling observed while examining the images, as though Grace's impossible smile was somehow aware of their scrutiny. The original glass plates were eventually seized by federal authorities, acting under provisions of the Interstate Commerce Act, claiming jurisdiction due to the photograph's influence on mail delivery and telegraph communications throughout the region. Reports from postal workers described an unusual number of undelivered letters and packages in areas where copies of the portraits were known to exist, as though the images somehow interfered with normal communication systems. By 1905, the original Whitmore family portraits had vanished entirely from public view, their location known only to a select group of government officials who maintained strict secrecy about their ultimate disposition. However, rumors persisted that copies continued to circulate among private collectors, passed from hand to hand through networks of individuals fascinated by supernatural phenomena and willing to pay extraordinary sums for authentic examples. The psychological impact of the Grace Whitmore case extended far beyond those who had direct contact with the photographs themselves. Throughout central Pennsylvania, parents reported dramatic changes in their own children's behavior following news coverage of the story. Children as young as 4 or 5 began displaying unusual knowledge, speaking of invisible friends, and demonstrating intellectual capabilities that exceeded their normal development. Several families sought medical attention for children who had begun smiling in ways their parents found disturbingly reminiscent of Grace's impossible expression. Dr. Edmund Carstairs, the Millbrook physician who had first examined Grace during her lifetime, documented over 30 cases of children exhibiting similar phenomena in the 18 months following her death. His medical notes describe a pattern of intellectual precocity accompanied by claims of contact with invisible teachers who provided advanced knowledge and guidance. Most troubling to Dr. Carstairs was the observation that affected children seemed to be preparing for some unknown future event, displaying a sense of anticipation and purpose that their parents found deeply unsettling. The town of Millbrook itself never recovered from the notoriety surrounding the Whitmore case, the constant academic study. Universities throughout the eastern United States established research programs dedicated to documenting and analyzing reports of supernatural phenomena, using the Whitmore photographs as their foundational case study. The scientific methodology developed to investigate Grace's impossible portraits became the standard protocol for examining claims of paranormal activity for decades to come. The photograph's influence extended into the emerging field of psychology as well, where researchers used the documented reactions to the images as evidence for unconscious pattern recognition and collective psychological responses to threatening stimuli. Dr. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, referenced the Grace Whitmore case in his early writings about archetypal imagery and its power to evoke profound psychological responses across cultural boundaries. Religious organizations throughout America grappled with the theological implications of the Whitmore phenomenon. The apparent survival of Grace's consciousness after physical death, documented through photographic evidence that resisted rational explanation, challenged traditional doctrines about the nature of the soul and the relationship between earthly existence and eternal life. Several denominations split over interpretations of what the photographs represented, with some viewing them as evidence of divine intervention, and others considering them manifestations of demonic influence. By the 1920s, official records relating to the Whitmore family had been systematically removed from public access, their disappearance attributed to routine file destruction and administrative reorganization. County birth records, school enrollment documents, and even cemetery records showed no trace of Grace Whitmore's existence, as though her brief life had been deliberately erased from historical documentation. Yet the story persisted in oral tradition throughout central Pennsylvania, passed down through generations of families who remembered the summer when a 6-year-old girl's impossible smile challenged everything they believed about childhood, death, and the hidden forces that might shape human destiny. The aftermath of Grace Whitmore's brief existence had created ripples that continued to spread through American society, influencing fields of study, religious beliefs, and fundamental assumptions about the reality, capturing only what exists before the camera's lens during the brief moment of exposure. The technology that Samuel Hartwell employed in 1901 was primitive by modern standards, relying on simple chemical processes and mechanical precision rather than digital manipulation or computer enhancement. Yet somehow, this basic equipment managed to record images that defied every principle of physics and rational understanding. How do we reconcile our faith in photographic evidence with documentation that appears to show the impossible? Perhaps the answer lies not in questioning the reliability of the photographic process, but in examining our limited understanding of what constitutes reality itself. The cameras of 1901 operated on the same fundamental principles that govern modern photography. Light reflected from subjects creates chemical changes in sensitized materials, producing permanent records of whatever existed during the exposure period. If Grace Whitmore's impossible smile was captured with perfect clarity, we must consider the possibility that something genuinely impossible was present in that parlor during those 30 seconds in July. The systematic erasure of official records relating to the Whitmore family raises additional questions about institutional responses to phenomena that challenge established paradigms. Government agencies, academic institutions, and religious organizations all played roles in the initial investigation of Grace's unusual abilities, yet within 2 decades, virtually all documentation of their involvement had vanished from public access. This pattern of official amnesia suggests either a coordinated effort to suppress information that might disrupt social stability, or perhaps something more sinister: the recognition that some truths are too dangerous for general knowledge. The influence of the Grace Whitmore case on subsequent generations of children throughout central Pennsylvania points to possibilities that extend beyond individual psychological trauma into realms of collective unconscious response, or even supernatural contagion. If dozens of children began displaying similar phenomena after hearing about Grace's story, we must ask whether they were responding to suggestion and imagination, or whether Grace's experience had something more powerful and aware than physical life suggests implications too profound for comfortable contemplation. Modern paranormal investigation, developed largely in response to cases like Grace Whitmore's, has produced thousands of documented incidents that seem to support the existence of phenomena beyond conventional scientific understanding. Yet for every piece of evidence that suggests supernatural influence, skeptical analysis provides alternative explanations based on fraud, suggestion, or misinterpretation of natural occurrences. The Grace Whitmore case remains unique because the multiple independent witnesses, the involvement of qualified professionals, and the physical evidence of the photographs themselves resist easy dismissal through conventional skeptical analysis. The role of childhood in supernatural phenomena deserves particular consideration in light of Grace's experience. Throughout history, children have served as focal points for reports of paranormal activity, from medieval accounts of demonic possession to modern cases of poltergeist manifestation. Perhaps the openness and neuroplasticity that characterize young minds make children more susceptible to influences that adult consciousness automatically filters or rejects. Grace's apparent ability to perceive and communicate with invisible entities might represent not abnormal pathology, but rather the persistence of perceptual capabilities that most children lose through socialization and education. The question of purpose haunts every aspect of the Grace Whitmore story. Her invisible friends repeatedly referenced her preparation for important future responsibilities, suggesting that her unusual development served some larger design that extended beyond individual experience. If supernatural forces were indeed influencing her development, what did they hope to accomplish through a 6-year-old girl in rural Pennsylvania? The answer to this question might reveal truths about human destiny and cosmic purpose that could transform our understanding of our species' role in a universe far stranger and more complex than we have imagined. As we reflect on this remarkable case from the perspective of more than a century later, we must acknowledge that our technological advancement and scientific sophistication have not brought us significantly closer to understanding what happened to Grace Whitmore in the summer of 1901. Wisdom, to recognize that the universe may contain forces and intelligences that operate according to principles we have yet to discover or comprehend. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the Grace Whitmore case may not be what it reveals about supernatural phenomena, but what it suggests about the hidden depths that may exist within ordinary human experience. If a 6-year-old girl in a small Pennsylvania town could access knowledge and abilities that transcended the limitations of physical existence, what other extraordinary possibilities might be waiting to emerge from the seemingly mundane surface of everyday life? The next time you look at an old family photograph, particularly one featuring children with enigmatic expressions, remember Grace Whitmore and her impossible smile. Consider the possibility that the camera might have captured more than the photographer intended, that behind those innocent faces might lurk awareness and purpose far beyond what we assume childhood to contain. And ask yourself, what secrets might be staring back at you through the faded emulsion of images you thought you understood, waiting for someone perceptive enough to recognize the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary frame of human memory?